Many of us since childhood have either been told about or have read about the account of the Exodus in Scripture. In fact, we've probably gone over it many times. We've probably heard the story and the account of all the different things that took place over and over again. In fact, across denominational lines, this account of Scripture is probably one of the best known accounts throughout all of Scripture. Even Hollywood has capitalized on the events of the Israelites in movies like the Ten Commandments. I mean, they have talked about this journey, this exodus that they have taken. God delivered His people from the hand of Pharaoh. He parted the Red Sea. He provided clean water for people to drink and manna for people to eat. It's amazing the things that He has done. One of the most interesting things of that whole account, though, is the attitude or the heart condition of those that were being saved, those that were on that journey. How many times in Scripture do we read about the Israelites complaining to Moses? There's no food for us to drink, Moses. What are we supposed to do? There's no water for us to drink, Moses. What are we supposed to do? Why have you brought us out here in the desert to die, Moses? Over and over again, we hear them complaining. Point, they say, we're better off being slaves than we are being out here. Can you imagine having that kind of thought process? What God has done and was continuing to do, and yet they thought their life in slavery was better. God did so many incredible things for His people, and yet somehow they seem to instantly forget about each of them as they happened. There didn't seem to be a memory of what God had done. Let's take a look at an example this morning. Just 3 days after God parted the Red Sea, the people started complaining about having water to drink. Exodus chapter 15, starting at verse 22. Moses led the Israelites from the Red Sea, and they went into the desert of Shur. For 3 days they traveled in the desert without finding water. When they came to Marah, they couldn't drink its water because it was bitter. So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What are we to drink?" I think we can pretty much all imagine how 3 days in the desert without water would be. I think we can all imagine that it would be a pretty miserable 3 days. We would all be probably desperately looking for that water. So I'm sure it was no easy thing for them to go through that. And I'll even give them the benefit of the doubt for a moment. They spent years upon years upon years as slaves in Egypt. Maybe they just weren't familiar with how God worked and what God would do and how much He cared. Maybe they didn't quite get it. But this was just 3 days after the Red Sea was parted, after the ground was dried up and the path was made clear for them to walk on. There is no way in the world I would forget something like that. Certainly not 3 days after the event. Yet it seems like they quickly forgot about the parting of that sea. And amazingly enough, they were in need of water. They were looking for water to drink. Wouldn't that be enough to remind them of what God had just done? But they didn't think about it. Instead, they complained and they grumbled and they murmured and talked to Moses about it. Think about how much different it might have been if their attitude, if their thoughts were a little different. If they'd have maybe approached Moses and said, we're really thirsty here, Moses. Could you intercede for us as you've done so many times? Could you ask God to provide some water for us somehow? Imagine how much different that would have been than the grumbling and complaining. Now, of course, we know that God met their need and God provided the clean water that they needed. Moses did indeed intercede for them, despite the Israelites' attitude He still provided for them the clean water that they needed. Then we move on from there, and along this journey just a couple of months later, and it seems like their minds were erased yet again. Exodus chapter 16, starting at verse 1. On the 15th day of the second month after they had come out of Egypt, in the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and we ate all the food we wanted, but you have brought us out into the desert to starve this entire assembly to death." You know, the way that's phrased, "you have brought us out," it's almost like they blamed Moses for delivering them out of the hands of slavery. They thought it'd be better if they died because they were lacking food. Now, we're not going to read through it all this morning, but we know again, Moses interceded. Once again, God provided, and another absolutely incredible miracle took place. The Word says bread rained down from heaven. I think about the snow this morning and how that snow was coming down. Imagine that was all bread raining down from heaven. You know, and this event of this bread raining down was not a one-time deal. It was over and over and over again. Every single day, God poured out exactly what they needed. He provided for them every day. They didn't even have to work for it, really. All they had to do was go out and pick it up. They didn't have to plant it and water it and harvest it and all of that at this point. They just walked out and picked it up off the ground and threw it in their basket. And they had food to eat. But their doubting, their questioning, their complaining, it went on, and it was continuously repeated over and over again. Even though God blessed them in so many ways. Let's look at some of what the whining accomplished for them. Turn over to the book of Numbers for a minute. We're going to look there this morning. The first 10 chapters in the book of Numbers gives us an overview of everything that took. Overview of Moses' obedience and the Israelites' disobedience. And we can see a lot of the details there. But when we get to chapter 11, we read this. Numbers chapter 11, starting at verse 1. Now the people complained about their hardships in the hearing of the Lord. And when he heard them, his anger was aroused. Then fire came from the Lord and burned among them and consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. When the people cried to Moses, he prayed to the Lord, and the fire died down. Could you imagine being in that camp and seeing that consuming fire encircling the camp? God frees his people from slavery. He parts the sea for them to cross. He leads them through the wilderness. He gives them food to eat and water to drink. On and on he provides for their needs. On and on he shows, he proves how he wants to care for them and take care of them. And all they do is complain. And complain and complain. Can you understand maybe why God's anger was aroused a little bit? I'm going to liken it for a minute to being a parent. Perhaps some of us can relate to it. Have you ever listened to your own children whine and complain about everything they don't have? But so-and-so has this, but they got to go there. Our kids have done that. Drives me crazy. There doesn't seem to be any joy or peace or happiness in everything that they have been blessed with. They don't understand that a warm bed with covers is a good thing. They don't understand that all the food in the cabinets is a wonderful blessing. They don't compute that. Instead, they whine and complain. So if that drives us nuts as parents, can you imagine just a little bit about how God might have felt when He delivered His people out of the land of slavery, provided for them over and over and over again. And all He got in return was whining and fussing and complaining. Let's look a little bit more at this journey this morning. When God told Moses that He was going to deliver the people from Egypt, He also said to them that He was going to bring them to a land flowing with milk and honey. We're all familiar with that idea. That's the promised land that He said He was going to give them. Exodus 3, 7 and 8. I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians, and I will bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. It's God's direct promise to the Israelites, to His chosen. He promised to give them that good, abundant land. But after miraculously meeting their every need, the people, the whiny people, stood at the edge of the promised land. God brought them right to it, right up to its edge. They could look out and see it. In fact, Deuteronomy 1 tells us that when they got to the edge, when they got to that point, Moses said to them, "Here is the land that God is giving you. Go out and take possession of it." They were right there, right at the brink of that plentiful land flowing with milk and honey. But the people weren't ready to go take possession of it yet. In fact, they wanted to go check out the land first. I don't know, maybe they thought God was going to cheat them on something. Maybe they thought He wasn't going to deliver as He said He would. I'm not sure what was going through their mind. But they said, let's first go out and make sure, or let's first go out and look at this land. It's kind of unbelievable, their reaction, isn't it? According to Deuteronomy 1, they asked Moses to send out spies. Moses, I'm going to assume here, consulted the Lord about this and was given the okay, because back in Numbers 13 we read this. The Lord said to Moses, "Send some men to explore the land of Canaan, which I am giving the Israelites." So God gave Moses the go-ahead. He said, "Send out the spies into the land. Let them go look." But look at what God said here. "Send some men to explore the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelites." I am giving to the Israelites. You know, it's almost like God saying, if you don't trust me, fine, go take a look at it. Go see that the land is exactly what I told you it would be. Get prepared to receive the gift that I'm about to give you. But understand that I, God, am giving you this land. They seem to miss that key part of the whole thing. That God wanted to give them this land. There's really no indication of them having to fight for it or earn it or conquer it. God was giving it to them. It was a gift to His people. The people had to have it their way, so they sent out the spies. 12 were chosen. They went out among the land, and they spent 40 days spying out this promised land that they were told they were going to get. 40 days, and they traveled about 500 miles in the course of 40 days. And you want to know something really crazy? In that 500 miles, in that 40 days, they didn't discover anything that they didn't already know. Nothing new. They didn't discover anything that they didn't already know about. In fact, Scripture tells us they brought back some of the fruit of the land, the clusters of grapes, the pomegranates, the figs. They brought all of that back, and they held in their hands the evidence of God's promise to them regarding the land. They tangibly held it in their hands. At one point, some of the spies even confessed that the land is indeed exactly what God said it would be, a land flowing with milk and honey. It is what He promised us. But none of that was enough for them. They didn't stay focused on God's promise. They didn't stay focused on the inheritance that He said He would give them. Instead, they trusted in what they could see. They trusted in what they could participate in, could see. The tangible evidence that was before them. They saw the giants of the land. They saw the big walled cities that were fortified and looked impossible to get past. And then they made an assumption. They assumed that they were going to have to fight those giants to take possession of the land. The land that God said He was giving them. Think about this whole scenario for a minute. Apparently, dividing the Red Sea and drying the land beneath it was not enough to convince them that God cared about them. They must have thought very highly of the people who built those fortified cities. They must have thought very highly of their construction skills, because they obviously thought that those walls around those cities were bigger and stronger than that sea that God had just parted. Think about it for a minute. They saw a stick being tossed into bitter water and making the water pure and clean and ready to drink. But apparently that was not good enough for them. They didn't think God was going to provide for them. Apparently waking up to a ground covered in bread from heaven wasn't enough proof for them. Apparently being guided through their wilderness journey by a pillar of fire or a cloud wasn't enough evidence for them that God was with them. The giants that they saw must have been just absolutely huge, because they didn't think that pillar of fire or that cloud could conquer those giants. Somehow they must have thought that those giants were mightier than Pharaoh's army, which God destroyed before their very eyes. Think about that. All of this, and the rebellion still wasn't over. They still kept complaining. We're going to continue on. Numbers chapter 13. When we read through Numbers, we find out that 12 spies went out to spy out the land, and 10 of those 12 spies came back and stirred up trouble. In Numbers chapter 13, starting at verse 27, we read this. They gave Moses this account when they came back. We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is its fruit, but the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there. Now jump down to verse 30. Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, we should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it. But the men, this is the other spies they're talking about, the men who had gone up with him said, we can't attack these people. They are stronger than we are. And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land that they had explored. Where is their focus? It's on themselves. These people are stronger than we are. They didn't even consider the fact that God was on their side. So they spread a bad report among the land. They admitted that everything was just as God said it would be, but then they turned their focus inward and said, we can't do this. We aren't strong enough. They didn't rely on God, their God that had delivered them from the land of slavery. They looked at this whole journey from the wrong perspective. They looked at it from their ability, from their strength, from their understanding, instead of from God's promise. And if it wasn't bad enough that they mumbled and murmured and complained all the time, they went around telling everybody else that the land was bad. Those 10 spies stirred up all kinds of trouble by saying bad things about the land. Now, again, notice something from this piece of Scripture. As the spies began their report to Moses, we read the words. They said, "We went into the land to which you sent us." Moses. They're talking to Moses here. We went into the land which you sent us. They didn't see this as God's promised land. They saw it as a place Moses was sending them to go. It was a wrong perspective. It was a wrong way of thinking. It's like, they had asked Moses to send people out to check out the land, but then they reply to Moses as if it's all Moses' fault. As if he's the one who did it. As if he's the one who caused the trouble. Were they putting their faith in Moses? Was their trust in him? Were they looking for a scapegoat, somebody to blame? It's somebody else's fault, not ours? Where was their mindset? They were very short-sighted. They were very self-focused, and they couldn't see the promise that God was giving them. Everything from the Exodus to their inheritance was approached from a completely skewed perspective. That night, after the spies talked about how bad things were in the land, Scripture tells us that the people gathered together basically in a mass rebellion. Let's read Numbers 14, starting at verse 1. That night, all the people of the community raised their voices and wept aloud. All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, "If only we had died in Egypt or in the desert. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives, our children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt?" And they said to each other, "We should choose a leader and go back to Egypt." I cannot imagine having that conversation. God did extraordinary, miraculous thing after extraordinary, miraculous thing. Despite their attitude and their self-centeredness throughout the entire journey, God freed them from the slaves and gave them absolutely everything they needed to survive this journey. But that wasn't good enough for them. They weren't happy with that. They wanted to go back to Egypt, back to their old lives, back to the bondage that they were delivered from. They stood at the threshold of their reward. That land of milk and honey was right in front of them, at their reach. But they wanted to go back to that life they had before. If we know the account, we know that at this point God had enough. Numbers 14, starting at verse 10. The glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting, and to all the Israelites. The Lord said to Moses, "How long will these people treat me with contempt? How long will they refuse to believe in me, in spite of all the miraculous signs I have performed among them?" You know the very first thing that jumps out to me about that particular passage? 2 words. These people. These people. It was not my people. It was not the Israelites. It was these people. This is a much, much different read than what we read in Exodus, when God said, "I have indeed seen the misery of my people. I am concerned about their suffering. Now he refers to them as these people. God was ready to destroy them completely, wipe them out from the face of the earth. He said to Moses, he said, I'll start a new generation of people with you. I'll make you into a new group of people. Moses, as he had done so often, interceded on behalf of the Israelites, and God chose not to destroy the nation. However, he did not allow any of them, with the exception of a couple. He did not allow the vast majority of them to enter that promised land that they stood at the threshold of. He said, that's it. I'm done. You guys are not coming in to this land that I was willing to give you. Listen to what he said. Numbers 14, verse 20. The Lord replied, I have forgiven them as you asked. Nevertheless, as surely as I live, and as surely as the glory of the Lord fills the whole earth, not one of those who saw my glory and the signs I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, but who disobeyed me and tested me 10 times, not one of them will ever see the land I promised on oath to their ancestors. No one who has treated me with contempt will ever see it. It took 40 years and a whole new generation of people before God would allow them once again to take the land that he was giving them. Now we look over this whole account this morning. We look over it from a bird's eye view. And we look at the beginning and we look at the end. And as we look at this account of the Exodus and the Promised Land, we can't help but wonder, what in the world were these people thinking? What was going through their minds on this journey? Why did they respond the way they did? God did miracle after miracle, and they experienced them all firsthand. Things that have never been seen or done before. And they got to witness it. He was trying to provide for them this beautiful place for them to live, richly blessed with food and many other things. He wanted to meet their need. He wanted to be their provider. He had their best interest in mind. He wasn't doing it for his sake. He was doing it for them. But on that entire journey, they fought and they rejected and they complained and they whined because things weren't their way, because things weren't smooth, because things weren't as they thought they should be, even to the point of wanting to go back to their lives of captivity. They wanted to go backwards in their journey, back where they came from. When we read through this, we see all of the mistakes. But they, on their journey, couldn't see all of the errors that they were making. They just whined and complained because things weren't as they expected them to be. Unfortunately, we're just like them. We are just like the Israelites. We are a whining, complaining, rebellious people. When things don't go exactly the way we think they should go, we instantly start complaining. We instantly start whining. We instantly start saying, God, why are you not doing this and this and this? Why isn't it the way that I thought it would be? That's our instant reaction. How many times has God's blessing been at our fingertips, but our fear, our insecurities, our flat-out disobedience have stopped us from receiving what God was trying to give to us? right there, right in front of us. But our rebellious nature pushed us away. Just like the Israelites, God forgives us over and over and over again. He forgives us. But how often have we missed out on blessings because of our attitudes, because of our short-sightedness? How many times does it take another 40 years before the opportunity comes back around to us again? How many times has that been a problem? Why do we fail to see? Why do we fail to remember what God has done all along our journey? Just like they forgot about the sea and the water and the bread and everything else. Why do we fail to remember those things that He has done for us over and over again? We may not have a pillar of fire going before us, directing our every steps, but God still says He will direct our every steps. If we trust Him, if we seek Him, if we look for those steps, He will make them clear to us. He will show them to us. We may not wake up with manna covering the ground every morning, but yet every day He gives us everything we need for that day. He provides for us over and over. How many times in our journey have we gone to spy out the blessing ahead of time, but then refused to receive it because of our actions, because of our disbelief, because of our uncertainties? We saw that it was everything that God had put before them was just absolutely incredible. But the people always had an excuse. The land is great. It is indeed flowing with milk and honey. Here's all the wonderful fruit. But the people are too big. The walls are too tall. The situation is too hard. There's too many rocks to stub my toe on. Excuse after excuse as to why we're not willing to accept what God is putting right in front of us. We forget that the God of all creation cares about every detail of our lives. And He's willing to help us through every piece, every step. I wonder this morning how many times we cause our own 40-year detour. How many times do we cause our own detour? Our lack of obedience or trust. We need to change our perspective through life. It's not about things being the way we think they should be. And that's hard for us. As people, as human beings, that's tough for us. Our focus has got to be on doing what God has called us to do when He has called us to do it.